Her hands are shaking, but not from age and not from cold. For 60 years, this midwife had delivered children, had known every sound, every smell of birth. But what she saw that night in a cramped Surrey cottage made all her experience worthless. Between the legs of the young woman, there was no child. There was a clump of fur, tiny claws, and a wet little snout that should not have existed. With a dull thud, the head of a rabbit fell onto the straw floor, bloody, slippery, as if torn straight from a womb. The woman on the bed, 24-year-old Mary, cried out, but it wasn't a cry of pain. It was a sigh of relief, as though a weight had left her body. The old midwife froze, realizing that no book, no superstition, had ever prepared her for this. And this was not the first time. In the past 2 months, Mary's body had produced 15 rabbits. Not rumors, not gossip. People had seen it with their own eyes. Think about it. We laugh at the past, telling ourselves peasants believed in silly tales. But this was not about foolish village women. This was a living woman, real blood, real contractions, and a midwife standing beside her, someone used to death and deformity. Yet even she could not explain what she saw. Already the first shock takes hold of us. If it's a trick, how could it be done? And if it's real, how is it possible? That mixture of disbelief and horror would turn Mary Toft into the greatest sensation in England, because soon it would not be superstitious neighbors coming to her hut, but the kingdom's most respected doctors. And they would swear with their own hands they had delivered these births. When the rumors of monstrous deliveries reached the nearby town, a man appeared in Mary's cottage, someone trusted far more than any midwife. His name was John Howard, a local surgeon. An educated man, he carried the ideas of the new science from village to village. He expected to see a mistake, perhaps a miscarriage, perhaps a deformed fetus. But what he witnessed burned into his memory forever. Mary writhed in bed, her belly rising in waves, her breath broken, her screams piercing. Howard examined her. Yes, the cervix was open. Yes, the contractions were real. Everything looked just like ordinary labor. And then, what emerged was not an infant, but scraps of cat's paws and torn pieces of rabbit flesh, warm, slippery, stinking of blood and rot. The surgeon could not look away. He touched them himself. They were real. He began to keep records. October 3rd, rabbit's legs and intestines. October 5th, 4 pieces. October 8th, a rabbit's head with one ear, the other appearing later. His notebook turned into a catalog of nightmares. The stench he described was unbearable, iron and blood mixed with decay, making him retch. But instead of exposing a fraud, Howard took a step that cost him everything. He wrote a letter to London, to the Royal Society, and in it he claimed, "I have witnessed the greatest miracle of nature, a woman who gives birth to living rabbits." That letter changed everything. Mary's story was no longer a village horror. It stormed into the world of scientists, physicians, and even the royal court. And what followed would destroy reputations and lives. Before her name spread across England, Mary lived like thousands of other women. A tiny hut in Godalming. A husband, Joshua, a poor weaver. 3 children, endless labor, endless hunger. In August 1726, she suffered a miscarriage. In that age, it was common, almost expected. But for her, it was the beginning of a nightmare. After the loss, the pains did not stop. She spoke of contractions, of strange movements in her belly, as if the birth wasn't over. Her mother-in-law, Anne Toft, a seasoned midwife, decided to examine her. But instead of the tissue remnants she expected, she found mangled pieces of animal flesh in her hands. At that time, even educated men believed in the maternal imagination. They thought that a pregnant woman's visions could imprint themselves on the fetus. See a rabbit, and the child might be born with a hair lip. Be startled by an animal, and its mark would remain in the womb. The idea of an entire animal forming inside her sounded absurd, but not impossible. Mary herself had been obsessed with rabbits during pregnancy. Her family couldn't afford meat, and she craved rabbit flesh desperately. She saw them in the fields, heard them squeak, but never tasted them. When, after her miscarriage, her body began producing these strange births, that old theory gave a ready-made explanation. What seems insane today fit neatly into the medical thinking of the time. Who first suggested turning this horror into a miracle, we will never know. Was it Anne who first received those bloody fragments? Was it her husband, with nothing to lose in poverty? Or some acquaintance who whispered that such a wonder could bring money and fame? Somewhere in that circle, the idea was born, to forge a sensation out of pain and desperation. And within weeks, Mary's home became a destination for anyone seeking a miracle, and there they would witness things that shattered their sense of what was possible.
Her house turned into a theater of nightmares. Day after day, her body seemed to produce new proof. Surgeon John Howard documented everything with painstaking detail. His diary read like a record of horrors. October 3rd, rabbit's legs and intestines. October 5th, 4 more pieces. October 8th, a rabbit's head, one ear, the other appearing hours later. They were never whole animals, always fragments. Heads, paws, entrails. Sometimes they came out warm, slick with blood and mucus. Sometimes cold, as if they had been dead for days. Howard even noted the smell: iron from the blood, rot from decay, and something else. Something that made you want to flee the room, clutching your nose. He noted that the skull bones were flattened, as if forced through a passage far too narrow. The fur was clotted with blood. Some fragments looked fresh, others half-decayed. The room where it all happened began to resemble a slaughterhouse. And here lies the true hook. None of this happened in darkness, none of it in secret. Doctors saw with their own eyes how Mary strained in contractions, how her belly tightened, how she cried out and then delivered those horrifying remains. Howard, a man of medical training, not a superstitious old woman, swore under oath that everything looked exactly like a real birth. Logic should have pointed to fraud, but instead of exposing it, Howard made a choice from which there was no return. He sent a letter to London, into the very heart of science. And soon the finest physicians in the kingdom, men who mocked superstition, would travel to Surrey to touch the impossible with their own hands. When John Howard's letter reached London, the story ceased to be a village sensation. King George himself took an interest. And it wasn't idle curiosity. If a woman truly gave birth to animals, it could rewrite the foundations of medicine and bring glory to England across Europe. To Surrey went the king's surgeon, Nathaniel St. Andre, and Samuel Molyneux, secretary to the Prince of Wales. These were not simple healers, but men of reputation and science. They traveled convinced they would expose a foolish hoax. Yet on the very day they arrived at the cottage, Mary seemed to be waiting. Once again, she began to scream in labor. St. Andre, a skilled anatomist, relied nothing but his own examination. His fingers felt what should have been a human fetus, but turned out to be soft fur and tiny bones. Minutes later, from her body slid the bloody torso of a rabbit. Saint Andre did not stop at witnessing. He cut the newborn open on the spot. Inside were hay and grains, in the lungs signs of breath, in the intestines rabbit droppings. Everything pointed to a creature that once lived and eaten. How it ended up inside Mary, no one could explain. For Saint Andre, it was a revelation. He began keeping his own records, sketching drawings, preserving samples and spirits. Doubt gave way to excitement. He was certain he was present at an event that would change science forever.
At this moment, the story rose to a new level. Physicians in royal coats sworn to science declared that they had seen the impossible. Their words carried more weight than gossip. In London coffee houses, men no longer debated taxes, but a woman from Surrey who gave birth to rabbits. But the greater the wonder grew, the sharper the doubts became. Soon another figure would enter the story, a man unwilling to ignore what others brushed aside. Within weeks, Mary Toft's name was known across England. Newspapers printed daily reports. Today, the woman from Surrey delivered yet another rabbit. Pamphlets with titles like "The Wonder of Wonders" sold by the hundreds. Cartoonists drew learned doctors with rabbit paws poking from under their gowns. In coffee houses, arguments raged over what it all meant. For some, Mary was a miracle, proof that the body could do the unimaginable. For others, she was a filthy fraud. But all awaited the next birth. Crowds gathered beneath her windows, straining to hear the cries of labor. Mary lay in bed, exhausted, yet continued to stage contractions. Her body trembled, her belly tightened, her face twisted in effort. Then came the new fragments: paws, heads, entrails. St. Andre and Howard vouched for their authenticity, swearing they had seen everything with their own eyes. But not all physicians were convinced. Among them stood the famed obstetrician Richard Manningham. He demanded proof, not testimony. His doubts rang clear. How could a woman give birth to animals if her body showed no signs of pregnancy? Why was her chest dry? Why was her belly flat between fits? While some doctors were dazzled, others raised their brows. Yet the more they argued, the greater Mary's fame grew. Her name was whispered even in royal chambers. She became both a symbol of wonder and a subject of ridicule. And still, cracks began to show. Among the fragments she delivered, some looked suspicious. All the same age, all the same breed, as though prepared beforehand. Those who looked closer began to suspect. Behind this story lay something darker than any miracle. By late November, the authorities lost patience. The disputes, the caricatures, the newspaper scandals had reached such a fever pitch that the woman from Surrey was ordered brought to London. From now on, everything would happen under constant watch. Mary was placed not in her home, not in a hospital, but in a special facility at Leicester Fields. An old bathhouse turned into a kind of laboratory. From that moment, she was never left alone. At her bedside stood doctors in shifts, ready to note her every movement. Each examination was humiliating and painful. Rough hands, cold fingers, endless checks. Manningham himself observed her closely, and what he saw tore down the legend.
Mary screamed, groaned, mimicked contractions, but nothing came. Days passed. No heads, no paws, not even a shred of fur. The scientists glanced at each other in confusion. Back in Surrey, every fit had ended with a new birth. Here, under unbroken surveillance, everything stopped. Saint Andre tried to defend his faith. He argued the move and exhaustion had disrupted the mysterious process. that Mary simply needed time to recover. But Manningham saw the truth. Without outside help, the trick failed. He noted her chest was still dry, her belly soft and flat, and her behavior strange. She always kept her thighs tightly closed, as if hiding something. And then came the first glimpse of the truth. Rumors spread that someone had tried to smuggle rabbits into the building. Servants whispered that Mary's relatives bribed staff to sneak animals inside. Doctors began to suspect if they waited long enough, the secret would betray itself. All that remained was for someone in the siege to make a mistake. And it happened very soon. On December 4th, within the London bathhouse where Mary was kept, the turning point came. A servant named Thomas Howard was caught at the entrance. In his pockets was a small rabbit he was attempting to sneak inside. When questioned, he confessed. The animal was meant for Mary. He had been bribed by her relative, Margaret Toft, to deliver live material for the next miracle. That same day, another fact surfaced. Her husband, Joshua, had been buying up young rabbits at markets for months. The number was so great that suspicions could no longer be ignored. Every thread led back to the same conclusion. Her family knew it, and they were helping her play this gruesome game. The doctors gathered their evidence and confronted Mary, but she kept denying it, holding out to the last. Then Richard Manningham took a decisive step. His words fell like a death sentence. "Since you are a miracle of nature, we will cut your body open from chest to thigh and see how your womb is made." He described the operation coldly, in detail, without a hint of compassion, and then he added, "without anesthesia." Mary turned pale. She knew this was no empty threat. Physicians of that era really were prepared to open bodies in the name of science. And at that moment, her resolve broke. On December 7th, 1726, she confessed. And the truth was worse than any rumor. After her miscarriage, when her body was still open and vulnerable, parts of animals, cat paws, rabbit carcasses, entrails, had indeed been inserted into her. Later, she learned to hold them inside herself, deep in her vagina, until the time came for birth. She strained, wept, forced herself into a show of agony, and the trick worked. Her words shocked even the hardest of doctors. What had seemed a miracle was really the product of unthinkable pain she inflicted on herself again and again. Yet the central question remained: why? What could drive a woman and her family to such a monstrous deception?
Only after the confession did the doctors grasp the scale of what Mary had done to her own body. Every performance cost her agony few others could have survived. To make the fraud convincing, she kept dead animal parts inside her for hours, sometimes a full day. In the hot, damp environment of her body, the tissues began to rot while still inside her. The stench of decay filled the room. The doctors wrote that every examination was accompanied by a reek that made them clamp their noses. Mary complained of constant pain, burning, weakness, yet she did not stop. She scratched her insides with sharp bones, drove filth and blood into her open womb. It caused infections, swelling, ulcerations. Contemporaries believed she must have suffered severe internal damage. Probably fistulas had formed, tears linking her vagina and rectum. That meant the pain and humiliation continued long after the spectacle ended. Her body had become a battlefield where every new rabbit left fresh wounds. And worst of all, she did it knowingly, again and again. Dead animal parts rotted inside her, poisoning her blood, causing fever and weakness. Sometimes she said she couldn't even get out of bed from dizziness and pain. But the moment a doctor appeared, she forced herself to strain, to scream, to bite her lips to make it look real.
The doctors realized no miracle could match the level of self-destruction this woman had reached. And now the question was not only how, but why? Why endure such torment? For fame? For money? Or had desperation pushed her beyond superstition itself? When the truth surfaced, it wasn't only Mary's hopes that collapsed. The doctors who had sworn they'd witnessed a miracle were suddenly at the center of ridicule. The loudest fall was Nathaniel St. Andres. Only recently, he had been the king's surgeon, a man trusted to touch the royal body. He had confidently written treatises on rabbit births, sketched anatomical drawings, sent samples to colleagues. Now cartoonists drew him with long ears and a tail, calling him the rabbit doctor. St. Andre lost everything. His post at court vanished, patients no longer trusted his hands. He never escaped the stigma of a gullible fool. People whispered he never again touched rabbit meat. The smell alone brought back the memory of how he became a laughingstock of all England. Howard, the local surgeon who had started it all, was also broken. Suspected of complicity, after all he had first proclaimed the miracle and first attended the births, he was arrested, though no guilt could be proved. Even so, his career was destroyed. He returned to Guildford and lived out his life in obscurity, without the fame he had craved. Against this backdrop, only Richard Manningham emerged a victor. He was the one who had insisted on exposing the fraud. After Mary confessed, Manningham published a treatise detailing the entire affair and underlining his own role. His reputation only grew stronger. He continued his career, and later it was he who delivered the future King George III.
Mary herself ended up in prison. She was charged with fraud and sent to Bridewell. But even the law stumbled. Technically, she had stolen no money, forged no papers. She had merely given birth to rabbits. Authorities struggled to write a crime next to her name. All they could do was keep her behind bars as a scandalous imposter. Even in confinement, she remained a celebrity. Crowds gathered at the prison gates to glimpse the rabbit mother. Her name had become a symbol, and her body an arena on which both doctors and society had forfeited their honor. When the uproar subsided a little, physicians and journalists asked the question that sounded more frightening than the hoax itself. Why? Why would a young woman subject her own body to such torment? In her confessions, Mary named different people. Sometimes it was her mother-in-law, Anne, who had supposedly suggested turning the miscarriage into a miracle. Sometimes her husband's sister, Margaret, persuading her there was money to be made. Sometimes Joshua himself, desperately seeking a way out of poverty. And sometimes she spoke of a wandering stranger who told her if the ruse succeeded, the king would grant her a lifetime pension. But behind all these versions stood one truth: poverty. She was 24, already had 3 children, worked the fields, lived in a filthy hut with a dirt floor, wore clothes eaten by time. No future except endless pregnancies and hard labor. Even rabbit meat, which she had craved during pregnancy, was an unattainable luxury. And when at last a chance appeared to escape, even through pain and blood, she seized it. Every cry, every night with bones and rot inside her body was the price of hope. Hope that one day she would be taken to London, declared a miracle of nature, and given money and freedom from hunger. She turned herself into an instrument, a living machine of illusion, because she saw no other way out. On the days when the doctors came, she prepared herself for the show, fasting so her belly would be flat, training to hold animal parts deep inside. She bit her lips and tongue to summon tears and make her agony look real. And in this truth lay a horror far darker than any so-called supernatural miracle. Mary was no witch, no messenger of the devil, but a woman whom despair had turned her own executioner. One might think the story should have ended with her confession, but the more closely doctors and witnesses recalled the details, the more questions remained, and some of those questions have never been answered,
even centuries later. For example, how was Mary able to control her body so completely? Physicians swore that during examinations they felt the cervix open, real contractions, movement inside. Such things could not be faked by will alone. Modern researchers suggest she may have been taught secret techniques known only to underground midwives and women who performed illicit abortions, methods to artificially widen the passage and manipulate the womb. But there is no proof.
There was another unsettling mystery. Surgeon Thomas Howard, no relative of Mary's, insisted until his death that he had felt fur grown into her body with his own hands. He swore the sensation could not have come from a dead rabbit. Even after her confession, he maintained, "I saw what cannot be explained." Others wondered, why were the rabbits Mary delivered always the same? All of them were young, 2 or 3 months old, of the same breed. Too many coincidences for chance. It seemed someone was preparing the animals in advance. But how exactly they were smuggled and hidden, no one could ever say for certain. And finally, the darkest question: why did so many people take part? Her mother-in-law, her husband's sister, her husband himself, all of them appeared to know and assist. What could drive an entire family to participate in such a monstrous play? The answer was simple and terrible: desperation and hunger. But even knowing this, doctors and witnesses struggled to believe a human being could willingly inflict such pain on themselves. That is why Mary Toft's story remains suspended between two worlds, the world of science and the world of horror, where explanations do not always bring peace. After her confession and interrogations, Mary was charged with fraud and sent to Bridewell Prison, the place reserved for beggars, vagrants, and tricksters. Yet even there she remained a celebrity. Crowds gathered at the gates to glimpse the Rabbit Mother. Ballads and satirical songs about her were sung in the streets. Her portraits were sold in shops, alongside images of kings and generals. She spent several months behind bars, yet the authorities faced a problem. What exactly was her crime? She hadn't extorted money directly, hadn't stolen. She had only deceived physicians. In the end, she was released. Officially, the case was closed quietly, but in the memory of the people, it lived its own life. Mary returned to Godalming, the very place where it had all begun. Outwardly, her life looked as before: work, children, poverty. But the stain never left her. In the parish register at the birth of her daughter in 1727, the clerk deliberately wrote, "the first child after the supposed rabbit breeding," a mockery carved into eternal record. Years passed, but the nickname clung to her. In 1740, she appeared again in court records, this time for receiving stolen goods. And again she was not listed simply as Mary Toft, but as the widow, the Rabbit Mother. That is how neighbors knew her, how she was remembered. She lived long for her time, 60 years, but even in her obituary her name was not written. It read only, "The deceiver, known as the Rabbit Mother, has died." To the nation, she remained forever the woman who dared to break the line between the human body and animal horror. To herself, she remained a prisoner of a name that never let her go, even into the grave. For 3 months in 1726, England lived in a world where a woman gave birth to rabbits. Scientists swore it was real. Royal surgeons risked their reputations. Ordinary people whispered by their firesides. And in the end, it was not a miracle, not mysticism, but sheer desperation.
The most chilling part was not that doctors believed the impossible. The most chilling part was that Mary consciously turned her body into a stage of torture. She inserted dead animal parts into herself, held them inside until they rotted, then strained as if giving birth to living creatures. She endured pain, stench, blood, tears, infections, all for a fleeting hope of escape from poverty. Mary's story revealed this. Monsters do not live in forests, and they are not born of magic. The real monsters are poverty and hopelessness, forces that can drive a human being to do to themselves what no sane mind could ever accept. Even after her confession, doctors continued to argue. Some swore they had felt real contractions. Others insisted the fur was part of her body. The samples vanished, the reports disappeared, as though science itself had tried to bury the shame. But memory could not be erased. 300 years later, Mary Toft's name still surfaces, in books, in articles, even in jokes. Her story has become legend, a symbol of how despair can turn a woman into her own nightmare. She never received the king's promised pension, never saved her family from poverty. But in one sense, she succeeded. People still speak of her. Her immortality lay not in money, but in memory. Terrible, grotesque, yet eternal. And there lies the final lesson. The monstrous births of rabbits were nothing but a fraud, but the pain, the hunger, and the willingness to tear oneself apart for the hope of a better life, that was real. And that is more terrifying than any fairy tale.